Thank you very much, Kojo, and thank you all for the invitation. I feel very honored to be here for this, especially the inaugural SBCC Summit. So, as Kojo said, I'm going to talk about the science of habit and what it maybe can tell us about how to change human behavior. As I was preparing for this and looking through the amazing agenda that we have for the next few days, and looking at the very specific behavioral outcomes that you guys are invested in changing, I just kind of went through the program and took note of some of the major behavioral outcomes. Right? This is probably not an exhaustive list, but over the next few days, these are some of the very specific behavioral outcomes that you folks are invested in. So interesting just to see the diversity there. But another thing from my point of view that's interesting about this is that it's pretty easy for us to place these behaviors on what you might think of as a kind of continuum of habit strength. And what I mean by that is that many of these things are behaviors that people perform very often. They're kind of woven into the fabric of everyday life. We don't think about them very much, and we perform them in the same setting, in the same kind of action sequence. And that's kind of the classic definition of a habit. So my way of roughly aligning them, you might disagree, would be something like this, right? So at the far right, we've got things that are occurring pretty much every day and in the same setting, and those we could think of as potentially really strong habits. And then really maybe the only thing here that perhaps has no habit component is maybe male circumcision, which by definition is a sort of single event in an individual's life. So really the main message of this talk is going to be that dimension really matters for people who are invested in changing behavior. And so why is that the case? Why is it that this habit strength distinction really is important? Well, there are a couple of kind of core insights from the behavioral sciences that I think help us here. So one is we know from studies kind of tracking people's real-world behavior, we know that about 45% of what people do occurs every day or almost every day in the same setting and with little or no thought. Right? So that's one kind of classic behavioral definition of a habit. So this is a lot of what human beings do, right? And the key thing is that even though these outward behaviors may look exactly the same, right, whether someone's doing it for the first time or for the 1,000th time, what we know is that when people repeat an action, especially in the same way and in the same setting, the internal mechanics, the cognitive, the brain systems behind that really undergo some very significant changes. And so as you think about something like learning to ride a bike, one memory system is in charge at the start, and then once it's become a learned skill, a habit, procedural memory takes over. So a different memory system is involved. We get actions like, if we take something like wash behavior, the specific actions that might make up food preparation become chunked together as one big action sequence that people don't really think about each individual step. And another interesting thing is that when we form habits, one thing we do is we kind of outsource control to the environment. So we start to unconsciously think, if I've done this thing in this environment before, it must be right and I'll just do it again. Right? So a kind of outsourcing of control to the environment. And interestingly, we can see in some cases even these things showing up in the brain. Right? So one of my favorite examples is that London cab drivers, their hippocampus is larger than aged matched controls who are not cab drivers, and the size of the hippocampus is correlated with how many years they've been driving. Right? So by repeatedly going through this habitual practice, they actually grow that brain structure. It's a kind of dramatic example. So that's kind of the science, but why should we, as people who care about behavior change, why should we care about this? Well, the answer is that it really matters, this shift really matters for how to change behavior. My favorite example of this comes from a study now that's a little bit old, about 15, 20 years old, a wonderful meta-analysis So a study that basically gathered together a whole bunch of studies that were trying to predict whether someone would do something in the future, like vaccinate a child or wear a seatbelt or use a condom, and try to predict that from two things at the current time. The first was their kind of rational planning, basically their intentions. Do I intend to use a condom the next time I have sex? Do I intend to vaccinate my child? And the other element was habit strength. So basically, what is that person's past history of engaging in that action? Is it a habit for them or not? And what they found in this really interesting analysis is that the influence of the kind of rational planning, intentional piece versus the habit strength piece really differs for different kinds of behaviors. So things that we do pretty rarely or in different environments, like vaccinating a child, that's very strongly predicted by your intentions and your planning, right? These are just correlation coefficients. It's a strong correlation between what you intend to do and then what you actually do in the real world. But if we look at things that people don't do very often, if we look at things that people do very often and in the same settings, so things like condom use or seatbelt use, then suddenly your intentions and your rational thinking no longer predicts your future behavior. So you may say, yes, I intend to use a condom the next time I have sex, but that intention, even though it's in your head, is not really translating to your behavior. And instead, it's just that the strength of that past kind of inertia, what you've done before, whether you used a condom the last time or you didn't, that is the strongest predictor. And of course, for us, the interesting thing is that maybe the vast majority of the things that we're interested in fit over here on the right-hand side, right? They're these daily or near daily activities that people perform without thinking about them too much and in the same setting. And indeed, other work has shown that if you take an intervention approach that focuses on trying to shift people's intentions, that works for the kinds of behaviors over on the left, right? The things that people don't do very often, like vaccination, then knowledge raising, changing people's goals and their planning, that's an effective way to change those behaviors. But the same is not true using those same approaches, right, for things that people do very often without thinking about them too much. So, the takeaway message is investing all of those resources in trying to change people's intentions and their rational thinking will buy you some behavior change, but not very much, and much less than for the kinds of behaviors over on the left-hand side, those less frequent ones. Okay, so what are the implications of this in the real world? Well, we've got great examples both in the developed world and in the developing world. So here's an example from the US. In the 90s, there was a lot of effort put into trying to increase vegetable consumption, and a 5-a-day campaign was developed, a lot of resources put behind it, and it succeeded in raising people's knowledge about the benefits of fruit and vegetable consumption. So you can see in 1991, only 8% of people in the US knew they were supposed to be eating fruit and vegetables in this quantity, and that had almost quadrupled just 5 years later. But here's people's behavior. It stayed exactly the same, right? So here's a similar pattern, hand washing in Bangladesh, right? The top line in blue there is in the population, people's knowledge of the benefits of hand washing with soap. And the dashed line at the bottom is their actual hand washing with soap, right? So this dramatic disconnect between what people know and say they want to do and what they actually do. So that's all depressing so far. But the interesting thing is, what can we do about it, right? Well, the one framework that I really like for thinking about this problem is to say, okay, we've done a great job as behaviour change people of thinking about what Kahneman popularised as System 2, right? This is a great, very simple framework for thinking about the different kinds of psychological systems that determine people's behaviour. And System 2 is the one that's all very familiar to us, right? It's people's rational planning, it's their attitudes, it's their intentions, it's maybe social norms, and emotions are a bit confusing and maybe fit somewhere between these two systems. And the other system, System 1, is much less familiar to us. Okay, so one way to summarize System 2 is it's the mental economist. It's the system that is constantly going around weighing pros and cons and trying to work out what's a valuable course of action for me. Should I be washing my hands now? Is it worth the bother? Is there a benefit associated with it? That's System 2. System 1 is this other system that is not evaluating those outcomes at all and is instead just saying, well, what did I do last time in this environment? And that system is in charge of a lot of behavior. And we're experts at trying to intervene around System 2, and we really have no idea about how to intervene around System 1. And so this slide's a little bit overwhelming. I'm not going to talk through all of these ideas here, but the main message here is that in the work that we've been doing recently, and this was initially in collaboration with FHI 360 and USAID, and then has been pushed forward further with the World Bank, their Water and Sanitation Program. So they've been very much partners in this thinking. The general idea has been to say, well, we're missing a set of tactical principles for how we can disrupt people's existing bad habits, right? And then form stable new habits around health-promoting behaviours. And so we've developed a set of principles to kind of fuel that thinking, all based on the basic science. At the very end, there's a couple of papers that I'll give you references to, so if you're interested in delving into the details, you can do that with those papers. But the basic idea is that the ultimate goal, right, is to take these new ideas, not throw out existing tactics that might be based on, increasing people's knowledge or changing social norms or educating people about rational benefits, not throw any of that out, but augment it and come up with new kinds of approaches that integrate tactics from both of these systems. Okay, so just let me give you a couple of case studies to bring some of these new principles to light. So let's take the example of smoking cessation and quit campaigns and where they started maybe 30 or 40 years ago versus where they are today. So as you know, the early campaigns around quit were focused very much on fear and knowledge raising. And some of those worked, some of them didn't work, and indeed some of the, especially drug campaigns around fear, backfired, at least in the US, and some of them actually increased drug-taking behaviour. There's fairly good data, right? So that's not a pattern that occurs consistently, but in some cases certainly has happened. And then if we think about what we did at point of purchase, it was to basically kind of maintain the environment that people are acting in, keep all the cues the same, but put a big kind of rational message like smoking kills and hope that will influence people's behaviour. And then in terms of kind of products that we're designing, the third element was, okay, so people are smoking, they're smoking in order to get nicotine, let's come up with some rational substitute, some other thing that delivers nicotine, right? And of course, all of these things maybe work to some degree, but none of them address habit, none of them address this System 1 element. So how have things moved forward? Here's an example from a quit campaign in Thailand that I think is a really nice example of how to move into a more habit-oriented thinking around messaging. So hopefully we'll just get this to play.
Khổ phai này. ขอยืมไฟแช็กหน่อย
ดูดเองจริงๆเหรอ
ไม่ให้ฮะจ่าเลย
ดูดไม่ดีนะต้องเลิกดูดได้มันมียาฆ่าแมลงอยู่ในใบบุหรี่ด้วยนะดูดแล้วหน้าแก่นะ
สูบบุหรี่แล้วก็ตายเร็วไม่อยากอยู่เล่นนานๆแล้วมันไม่ดีรู้เปล่าสูบแล้วเป็นทั้งมะเร็งปอดโรคโป่งพองเส้นเลือดในสมองแตก
ไม่ดีแล้วพี่ดูดทำไมล่ะคะ
So obviously that's wonderful on a number of levels, right? First of all, it shows that all of that rational knowledge about the risks of smoking is in the heads of the smokers and yet is not influencing their behavior, right? But I think what's so clever about it, right, is that it comes up with a communication vehicle that really disrupts the status quo, right, and creates some forum where people can, in a new way, connect up their intentions with their action, right? And so that's the kind of epitome of a habit disruption strategy in communication. Moving on, if we think now about point of purchase, so a habit perspective would say you can't just keep the purchase ecosystem the same. You need to disrupt the cues in some way that are supporting the current behaviour. This is what cigarette packets look like in Australia, where I'm from. And so one of the things that's so clever about this packaging is, yes, it's a sort of social norm intervention, right? It makes cigarettes disgusting. But another very clever thing it does is that it means that people don't keep their cigarettes out like on the table. They put them away in their bag, which adds that little piece of friction so that their ability to chain smoke is reduced, right? Because now the cigarettes are not in the visual field. They can't be triggered by just seeing the packet of cigarettes sitting there. And then finally, on the product innovation front, right? So if we think about nicotine patches as kind of a rational substitute for cigarettes, they deliver nicotine. What about having substitutes that are not just rational substitutes, but are also, let's call them habit substitutes or behavioural substitutes? So things like Nicorette gum that is piggybacking on an existing habit that people have, right? Smokers especially like to chew gum. Or e-cigarettes, despite obviously there are controversies around whether e-cigarettes overall are a good thing or a bad thing. But from a habit point of view, they allow people to maintain the behavioural script that they have, right, for smoking and just switch out the product. So a couple of other quick ideas before I finish up, right? So from a habit perspective, one of the things we know is that people's existing bad habits and their good habits are disrupted when there are changes to their external environment. So things like if they move house, that creates, or seasonal migration, things like that, create a window of opportunity to change behaviour. So here, two nice examples of that. So public campaigns to increase public transport use. They're much more effective if they target people who've recently moved house, right? They're much more likely to take up those vouchers than people who've been living in the same house for a long time because all of your existing habits have kind of been disrupted with the move. A nice example, not yet published, but Mushfiq Mubarak at Yale is doing work on open defecation and targeting seasonal workers during migration patterns. So basically, when they're away from their home environment, targeting them with open defecation interventions at that time to see whether they're more likely to change and then take those new behaviours back with them to their home environment. Another idea I think that's very valuable is this notion that even small additions of friction or difficulty or effort to old bad behaviours and the removal of friction around new behaviours that are desirable can be really, really valuable. So a couple of examples of this are obviously smoking bans in the UK. There's great data that just making people, have to walk outside into the cold will add in enough friction to really help reduce that impulse smoking behaviour. On the plus side of like removing friction from desired behaviours, pre-packaged medications obviously do that, remove a lot of the choice and decision making and effort associated with dosing decisions. Here's a lovely example, I think, from Vietnam, the iron fish. Some of you will know this. So this is basically an alternative to giving people iron tablets, which obviously you have to remember to take this thing every morning, right? Which is very difficult and effortful and requires decision making. The iron fish is a clever little invention that it's as you can see it here, an iron fish that you leave in the cook pot, and it just slowly releases little amounts of iron into the food as you're cooking. So no decision making is required, no behaviour is required. You just leave it there. It piggybacks on a cultural symbol that has a lot of meaning in Vietnam. Another kind of interesting emerging idea, I think, is about the value of ritual. Right? So the core idea here is that ritualized behaviors, which you can think of as kind of habits that have taken on deeper psychological meaning for people, they can be a really effective way to drive uptake of new behaviors and also drive sort of dissemination of new behaviors in communities. So a couple of quick examples of that. This is a little heavy-handed, but I really like this example from the Philippines of an intervention to stop people using dynamite to fish on delicate coral reefs. What they did was submerge statues of the Madonna on the reef, so kind of using a highly ritualized, in that case, religious symbol as a kind of entry point into that intervention, much more effective than just trying to convince people that using dynamite is a bad idea for the ecosystem. Obviously, ritualized inking of the finger in voting. And you can think of more creative ways to do this, like the No Toilet, No Bride campaign in India, right? Which is basically trying to take one behavior, open defecation, and say, how can we use a very important cultural ritual, namely marriage, as a vehicle for changing this behavior? So the No Toilet, No Bride campaign came out of that idea. And then a final one, and then I'll finish up, is this idea that often people continue with bad habits not because they're choosing to do it, but because in the moment they forget. And they are cued by that very familiar environment to just do what they've always done. If that's not washing their hands before they eat, then they're cued by the environment. So coming up with situational triggers that are going to be physically present there in the environment when people need to perform a new behaviour can be really powerful. I love this example from Robert Dreibelbus's work, finding that just painting footsteps coming out of the latrines in schools, going to the wash stations, so a very, very affordable nudge, had a dramatic effect on the odds that people would go and wash their hands coming out of the toilet. And again, a wash example, open defecation, writing Arabic script near common open defecation sites in Bangladesh has been found to be effective at sort of triggering people in that moment to choose to do something else. So I'm gonna wrap up there and just say there are a series of examples, a series of principles for how you can fold habit thinking into your existing ideas and your existing strategies. I do very much like taking that approach that none of this thinking is about throwing out existing strategies and tactics, but it's about augmenting them with habit thinking. I went through just a couple of the principles there, but if you're interested in reading more about this thinking, there are a couple of working papers. The USAID one done with FHI 360, that's already released. The World Bank one, which is on open defecation, that'll be released in the next couple of weeks. So I'll wrap it up there. I'll wish for all of you that your good habits are strong and your bad habits are weak. And thank you very much for listening.